She got her whole team killed, and now she's standing on my range. Harlan said it loud, said it slow, said it directly at her face in front of 30 soldiers with the full weight of his rank behind every word. Then he shoved her rifle off the rack. It hit the concrete floor, and the sound cracked through the entire range like a gunshot. Nobody laughed this time. Nobody moved. Because what he just did wasn't discipline. It wasn't evaluation. It was execution. Public, deliberate, designed to erase her. Mara Voss looked down at that rifle on the ground. Then she looked back up at him, and something in her eyes went very, very still. If this story moves you, subscribe to this channel and follow along until the very end. And drop a comment with the city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The morning started the way most mornings at Fort Drayton started, with noise. Boots hitting pavement, metal lockers slamming shut, voices cutting through the dry desert air like something that had no patience for quiet. The base was a living machine, and the machine never stopped moving. But Sergeant Mara Voss moved differently through that noise. She always had. She walked with the kind of stillness that made people uncomfortable, the kind that suggested she was listening to something the rest of the world couldn't hear. She wasn't tall. She wasn't physically imposing in the way that turns heads for obvious reasons. She was lean and precise, and there was something in her eyes, a flatness, not of emotion, but of extreme focus that made even experienced soldiers pause when she looked at them directly. She had arrived at Fort Drayton 3 days ago on a transfer order that nobody had fully explained. The paperwork was clean but minimal. The details of her last deployment were classified at a level that made the base administrator blink twice when he processed it. Her service record was long, but several sections had been blacked out with the kind of ink that suggested someone very high up had decided the public version of her story was not the full version. And in a military base, that kind of mystery travels faster than any official memo. By the second morning, soldiers were talking, not openly, not loudly, but in the way that information spreads when people are curious and slightly unsettled, in fragments, in hallways, in low voices near the coffee station before formation. She was the only one who came back from Ardent Ridge. You hear what she did out there with one shot? That's not a real story. That kind of shot doesn't exist. I'm just telling you what I heard. Who told you? Someone who was there. Nobody could say exactly who that someone was. The story kept moving anyway. By the third morning, the morning that would change everything, the rumor had grown into something with weight. Mara Voss had made an impossible shot, under impossible conditions, during a classified operation that had gone wrong in ways that weren't discussed in official channels. She had saved people, or maybe she hadn't saved everyone. The story changed depending on who was telling it. What didn't change was the ending. She was the only one who walked out. And that one detail had split the base into two camps before she'd even introduced herself to anyone. Half the soldiers looked at her with something close to reverence, the kind you give to people who have survived things you can't fully imagine, the kind that's partly respect and partly relief that you weren't there yourself. The other half looked at her with something harder to name, skepticism wrapped inside something older and more defensive. Because when a story gets big enough, when a name starts carrying that kind of weight, there are always people who feel the need to test it, not out of cruelty exactly, out of a need to restore the order they understand. The order where what they know is still the top of the mountain. Lieutenant Commander Bryce Harlan was the flag planted at the top of that mountain. He had 17 years of service, 2 combat tours, a commendation from an admiral he still mentioned by name when the occasion called for it. He ran the advanced marksmanship program at Fort Drayton, and he ran it with the kind of absolute authority that came from having genuinely earned his position. He was not a bad soldier. He was not even in the deeper sense of the word a bad man. But he was a man who had built his identity on being the standard, the measure, the person other people were compared against. And when someone arrived whose story suggested they might exist outside his frame of measurement entirely, something in him went quiet and cold. He hadn't sought out the rumor about Mara Voss, but it had found him anyway the way those things always do. And by the third morning, it was sitting in his chest like something he needed to deal with. He dealt with it the way he dealt with most things, directly and publicly. The range session that morning had 40 soldiers present. It was a standard evaluation accuracy drills, time sequences, stress shooting under simulated pressure. Nothing unusual. Harlan had run 100 sessions like it. But when Mara Voss walked onto the range and took her position near the back, he stopped mid-sentence. The soldiers around him noticed. A few of them had been watching for this moment, maybe without fully admitting it to themselves. The collision between the story and the man who had built his reputation on having no patience for stories. Harlan looked at her for a long moment. Then he turned back to the group and said loudly and casually, "Someone explain to me why we're wasting range time on a ghost story." The laughter came. It always comes in those moments. Not because everything is funny, because when authority decides something is a joke, people laugh to align themselves with the authority. It's faster than thinking. It's safer than disagreeing. Mara didn't flinch. She stood with her weight-balanced rifle at her side, and she let the laughter happen. Her expression didn't shift. She wasn't performing calm. She just was calm. The way people are calm when they have already survived something much louder than laughter. Harlan walked toward her slowly. The soldiers parted without being told to. "Voss," he said, "you're the one they're calling the ghost shot, right? That's not a name I gave myself, sir." "No, but you haven't corrected it either." "I haven't heard anyone ask me to correct it directly, sir." Something moved across his face, not quite anger, something sharper, the recognition that she wasn't going to make this easy. "You qualified on the M110 at last station?" "Yes, sir." "What was your score?" 94. Harlan nodded slowly in the way that suggests a number is technically acceptable and nothing more. 94, that's solid. "Thank you, sir. It's not legendary." The word landed like he'd placed it there deliberately. Mara held his eyes. "No, sir, it's not." "So I'm curious," he said, turning slightly so the soldiers behind him could hear clearly where the legend comes from. Because legends need a foundation, and 94 on a standard qual isn't the foundation of the kind of story I've been hearing. "With respect, sir," Mara said quietly, "the stories aren't mine to tell or validate." "But they follow you." "Yes, sir." "And you don't think that's a problem?" "I think it's a fact, sir." "Facts aren't problems, they're just facts." Harlan's eyes narrowed slightly. He wasn't used to this. Not the content of what she was saying, but the way she was saying it, without heat, without aggression, without any of the social mechanisms people usually use to soften a disagreement with a superior officer. She was responding to him like she was reading lines from a manual, polite, accurate, completely unreachable. It unsettled him more than anger would have. "Run the standard sequence," he said finally. "Show me what 94 looks like." She ran it, clean, efficient, no wasted movement. She didn't rush, and she didn't slow down for effect. She hit her marks the way someone who has run the drill 1,000 times hits them, not with excitement, but with the quiet competence of someone for whom this is not the hard part. 93 on the live evaluation. 1 point under her previous score, which happens when conditions shift, when a different rifle has a slightly different pull, when the light is different. Harlan watched without expression. When she lowered the rifle, he said, 93. "Yes, sir." "And you're satisfied with that?" "It's an accurate representation of my performance on this sequence in these conditions with this weapon." "Yes, sir." But the story, he said, louder now clearly for the audience, the story says you can do things that 93 doesn't suggest. The story says Arden Ridge. The story says a shot that shouldn't have been possible. The story says you saved lives. A ripple moved through the watching soldiers. Not quite sound, more like a collective held breath. Mara said nothing. "So which is it?" Harlan continued. "Are you the soldier who scores 93 on a standard evaluation, which is good, Voss, I'm not dismissing it, or are you the story, because you can't be both?" The silence that followed had a texture to it, the kind of silence that is actually full of noise, the sound of 30 people deciding what they believe, what they want to believe, and what they're afraid to say out loud. Mara's voice, when it came, was still even. "With respect, sir, that's a false choice." Harlan blinked. "A soldier who scores a 93 on a standard drill in controlled conditions," she continued, "is not in contradiction with a soldier who performed under extreme stress in a non-standard situation. Those are different measurements of different things." "That sounds like an excuse, Sergeant." "It's a distinction, sir, not an excuse." The shift in the air was subtle but real. A few soldiers exchanged glances, not laughter this time. Something more complicated. Harlan stepped closer. Close enough that this was now a private conversation happening in front of a public audience, which is one of the more uncomfortable positions a person can be placed in. I've been in this program for 9 years, he said, his voice dropping slightly. I've evaluated hundreds of shooters. I've seen people come in here with stories, big stories, impressive stories, and I've watched them fall apart when the pressure is real and the cameras aren't running. So when someone walks onto my range with a file that's been half blacked out and a reputation built on a story that nobody can fully verify. Sir, he stopped. She had interrupted him, not rudely, but clearly and deliberately. Sir, she said again, still looking directly at him, I didn't ask for the reputation. I didn't ask for the file to be classified, and I didn't ask to be evaluated based on what other people have said about me. I'm here to do my job. If there's something specific about my performance you want tested, I'm ready to be tested. The silence after that was different, fuller. Harlan stared at her, and for just a fraction of a second, so brief that most people in the crowd probably didn't catch it, something moved behind his eyes. Not retreat, but recalibration. He turned back to the group and said, back to your stations. The session continued, but something had changed in the air of the range. Everyone could feel it, even if nobody could have described it precisely. The dynamic had been tested, and the test hadn't gone entirely the way Harlan had expected it to. Mara returned to her position and ran 3 more sequences that morning. Each one clean, each one consistent, not spectacular, not the stuff of legend, just the work of someone who knew what they were doing and did it without performance. During the water break, a young corporal named Davis approached her from the side, trying to look casual and not quite managing it. Hey, he said. She looked at him. I laughed earlier when the commander said, I know, she said. I didn't mean anything by it. She studied him for a moment. He was young, maybe 22, the kind of young where the face hasn't yet learned how to hide what the brain is thinking. Yes, you did, she said, not unkindly, just factually. He opened his mouth, closed it. You laughed because you thought it was the safer choice, she continued. And maybe partly because you weren't sure what to believe, and laughing felt easier than figuring it out. That's not nothing. That's actually pretty human. Davis stared at her. But next time, she said, maybe try to figure it out first. She capped her water bottle and walked back to her position. Davis stood where she'd left him for a long moment. Then he went back to his station too. The morning session ended at 1100. Harlan called it with his usual efficiency, gave the standard debrief, dismissed the group. He didn't look at Mara again. She didn't wait for him to. But in the parking area, as soldiers filtered out, she heard her name spoken in a tone she recognized. The tone of someone relaying information they know is significant. She turned. Private Reyes, one of the base administrative staff, was jogging toward her with a message tablet. Sergeant Voss, request for your presence at 1400 Building C, Admiral Kincaid's office. Mara took the tablet, read the message once. Thank you, she said. You know what it's about, Reyes asked, and then immediately looked embarrassed for asking because that was clearly not a question he was supposed to ask. Mara handed the tablet back. Not yet, she said. But something in her expression, a small shift barely visible, suggested that she was already thinking about it. Already running through the possibilities with the same methodical focus she brought to everything else. Because in her experience, when an admiral's office requested your presence 2 days into a new posting, it was never about routine matters. It was about something that needed to be handled. And the people who had decided to handle it had decided she was the right person for the room. She didn't know yet how right they were. She didn't know yet what would happen at 1400 or what would walk through that door or what a single bullet placed on a table could mean. She just walked back toward her quarters in the dry desert heat, and she let the morning settle in her mind, and she thought about what it means to be measured by people who have already decided what the measurement will show. She thought about Ardent Ridge. She always came back to Ardent Ridge, not because she wanted to, but because it was still there sitting in the back of everything she did, the way a scar sits not painful exactly after enough time, but present, permanent. A reminder that some moments don't let you leave them. They just let you carry them forward. She had made a decision that night in the dark, in the wind, and the absolute silence before the shot. She had made it alone with no one to confirm she was right, no one to share the weight of it, no one to blame if she was wrong. And then she had pulled the trigger. And then she had lived with what came after. She was still living with it. That's the thing nobody tells you about defining moments. They define you once in the doing of them. And then they define you again every time someone else finds out about them. And then they define you again every time you have to stand in a room full of people who have built an opinion of you based on a version of the story they got secondhand. What no one tells you is that the shot itself, the actual physical act of pulling the trigger, was the easy part. Everything after was harder. She reached her quarters, pulled the door closed behind her, sat on the edge of the bed and looked at the wall for a long moment. 1400, Admiral Kincaid. She had heard his name. She knew his reputation. In the way that everyone in certain circles knew certain names, not from personal contact, but from the shape they left on situations. The decisions that came from his office moved quickly, and they moved in one direction. He was not a man who did anything without a reason. So there was a reason, she just didn't know what it was yet. She lay back on the bed, closed her eyes, and did what she had trained herself to do before anything important. She made herself go quiet, not empty. Quiet. There's a difference. Empty means nothing is happening. Quiet means everything is happening, and you're watching it without interfering. She watched the morning replay. Harlan, the laughter, the 93, the corporal, the way the air on the range had shifted. She felt again what she had felt in that moment when Harlan stepped close and lowered his voice. Not fear, not anger, but something older and more specific. The feeling of being measured against a standard designed to make her small. The feeling of being inside someone else's story about who she was with no way to step outside it and just be herself. She knew that feeling well. She had learned over many years that the only answer to it was not to argue, not to perform, not to prove anything in the moment. The only answer was to wait, because the right moment always came. And when it came, one clean action was worth more than 1,000 arguments. She had learned that at Arden Ridge. She had learned it the hard way. At 1350, she stood up, straightened her uniform, and walked toward Building C. The desert heat hit her when she stepped outside, that flat, absolute heat that doesn't apologize for itself, that just is what it is. She walked through it without rushing. She had 6 minutes. 6 minutes was enough. At 1358, she stepped through the door of Building C and into whatever was coming next. She didn't know his name yet, the older man, the quiet one, the one who would walk forward later with no medals and no noise, and a single bullet in his hand. She didn't know what he would ask of her. She didn't know that in a few hours the entire base would be standing in a silence so complete you could hear the wind move. She just walked through the door, and the story moved forward. The rifle was still on the ground. Nobody had picked it up. That detail, that one small, specific detail, said everything about what had just happened on that range. When a weapon hits the floor in a military setting, someone always moves to retrieve it. It's reflex, it's training, it's what you do. But nobody moved, because the man who had knocked it there was still standing, still watching, still waiting to see what Mara Voss would do next. And something about the way she was looking at him made every single person on that range decide, without consciously deciding, that this moment needed to play out without interference. Mara looked at the rifle for exactly 2 seconds. Then she bent down, picked it up, wiped the barrel once with the back of her forearm, and set it back on the rack. She didn't look at Harlan when she did it. That's what got him. "I'm talking to you, Sergeant." "I heard you, sir." "Then look at me when I'm speaking." She turned, slowly, and when her eyes found his, there was nothing in them that he expected. Not rage, not tears, not the defensive scramble of someone trying to protect themselves. Just that same flat, focused stillness, like she was watching him from a long distance, even though he was 3 feet away. "You have something to say about Arden Ridge," she said. "Say it." The air on that range changed in a way that had nothing to do with temperature. Harlan's jaw tightened, because she had just done something he hadn't anticipated. She hadn't retreated. She had opened the door wider. She had looked at the thing he was using as a weapon and said, "Come on," then bring it all the way in. And that kind of move in front of an audience puts the person who started the aggression in a position they didn't plan for. He had planned for her to crumble, or to argue, or to appeal to rank and protocol. He had not planned for her to stand completely still and invite him to finish what he started. 4 soldiers, he said, lowering his voice slightly, not out of mercy, out of control. 4 soldiers went into that situation with you. 1 came out. You want to tell me that's a record or worth celebrating? No, sir. No. Celebrating is not the word I would use. Not for any part of what happened at Arden Ridge. Then what word would you use? She held his eyes. Surviving, she said quietly. I would use the word surviving. Something moved through the group of watching soldiers. Not sound, more like a collective shift of weight. The kind that happens when a conversation goes somewhere nobody expected it to go, and suddenly it's not entertainment anymore. Suddenly it's real. Harlan felt it, and it irritated him the way a wound irritates when pressure is applied. He had come here to establish something, to restore an order that the rumors about this woman had started to disrupt. And she was standing there turning his attack into something that made the crowd feel sorry for her instead of skeptical of her. That wasn't how this was supposed to go. Surviving isn't the same as skill, he said. No, sir, it isn't. So what are you, Voss, a survivor or a shooter? Today, she paused, one breath. I'm a sergeant who would like to complete her range evaluation, sir. Corporal Davis, standing 8 feet to the left, made a sound that was almost not quite, but almost a laugh. He turned it into a cough immediately. But it had already happened, and 3 people around him had heard it, and Harlan had heard it too. He turned his head toward Davis. Slowly, Davis went rigid. Something funny, Corporal. No, sir. Then what was that? Cleared my throat, sir. Dry air. Harlan stared at him for a long 3 seconds. Davis didn't blink. He was working very hard at not blinking. Then Harlan turned back to Mara, and his voice had a new edge in it, the edge of a man who knows the room is starting to slip and doesn't like the feeling. You want to complete your evaluation, he said. Fine, let's evaluate. He walked to the far end of the rack and pulled out a different rifle. Longer, heavier, a precision platform not typically used in standard qualification drills. He set it on the bench in front of her with a sound that was deliberate and loud. This one. Mara looked at it. That's not the qual weapon, sir. It is now. That change requires a written authorization from law. Are you questioning my authority on my range, Sergeant? The pause that followed had weight. Real weight. The kind you can feel pressing down on your shoulders. No, sir, she said. Then pick it up. She picked it up. She checked it the way you check an unfamiliar weapon methodically without rushing, running through each point of contact with the focus of someone who understands that skipping a step here is how accidents happen. Harlan watched her do it and couldn't find anything to criticize in the process, which seemed to frustrate him further. Range is set at 800 meters, he said. Static target, standard silhouette. You have 3 rounds. 3 rounds is not standard for... I know what's standard. 3 rounds. She looked downrange. 800 meters. In the morning heat with the air starting to shimmer. With an unfamiliar rifle she had never zeroed, never adjusted, never fired. Behind her, Private Reyes had appeared at the edge of the range. He wasn't supposed to be there. He had clearly come from Building C with something, and now he was standing at the perimeter watching, and there was something in his posture that suggested he was uncertain whether to interrupt. Mara didn't know he was there yet. She was already settling into position behind the rifle. She went still. The kind of still that has a sound to it, not silence exactly, but the absence of excess. Everything that wasn't necessary had been set aside. The crowd, the pressure, the weight of Harlan's agenda. She had put all of it in a room inside herself and closed the door, and now there was only this, the weapon, the distance, the target. The first shot hit 6 inches low and 2 inches left. Expected. Unfamiliar rifle, no zero data, no adjustment. 6 inches at 800 meters was actually an impressive baseline. She noted it, adjusted her internal calculation. No external movement, just the process running clean and quiet behind her eyes. The second shot hit 3 inches low, dead center on the horizontal. Better. She was reading the weapon now, feeling where it wanted to go versus where she needed it to go. Harlan said nothing, but she heard his breathing change. The third shot, she waited longer than usual. 11 seconds. 12. The crowd started to shift. Somebody behind her exhaled too loudly and then seemed to regret it. She fired. Center mass, clean, dead center. The silence afterward was different from the silence before. Before the shot, the silence had been anticipatory people holding their breath, waiting for her to fail. After the shot, the silence was something else. The kind that happens when reality doesn't match the story you came in with. Harlan walked to the data monitor without speaking. He looked at the shot placement, looked at it for a long time, then he said, "Lucky adjustment." And that's when Private Reyes stepped forward. "Sir, excuse me, sir." Harlan turned. The irritation on his face was now fully visible. "What?" "Sir, I have a priority message from Admiral Kincaid's office. It's addressed to Sergeant Voss, and it was also copied to you, sir." The range went absolutely quiet. Because when an admiral's office sends a message that is copied to a lieutenant commander on his own range during an evaluation he is actively conducting, it is never routine. It is never coincidence. It is a hand placed on a shoulder that says, "We see what is happening here, and we have opinions about it." Harlan's face did something complicated. The muscles in his jaw moved. His posture didn't change. Years of training made sure of that. But something behind his eyes shifted in a way that the soldiers standing closest to him would remember later. "Give it to her," he said finally. Reyes handed the tablet to Mara. She read it. Once. Then she lowered the tablet and looked at Harlan. "The Admiral has moved by my 1400 meeting to 1300, she said. "I need to leave the range. The evaluation isn't complete. The Admiral's office seems to consider it complete enough, sir." Another pause. Fuller than the ones before it. Harlan looked at the tablet in her hand, then at her, then at the 30 soldiers around them, all watching, all reading the air the way people do when power is being negotiated in front of them. "Dismissed," he said. She handed the rifle back to the rack assistant, collected her kit, and walked off the range without looking back. Not because she was afraid to look back, but because there was nothing back there worth looking at. What mattered was ahead. What mattered was Building C, and whatever Admiral Kincaid had decided was urgent enough to move up by an hour. She heard Harlan's voice behind her, resuming the session, reasserting control, redirecting the group's attention with the practiced ease of someone who has run rooms for a long time. She didn't listen to the words. She just moved. Reyes fell into step beside her. "You're not supposed to walk me in," she said. "I know, is everything okay?" She looked at him briefly. He was young, even younger than Davis. Something about his face suggested he had watched the whole exchange on the range and was still processing it. "It will be," she said. That third shot," he said. "I saw it on the monitor." "That was a shot," she said. "It was just a shot." He nodded but didn't look convinced. They reached Building C at 12:52, 8 minutes early. Mara stopped at the entrance, turned to Reyes. "Thank you," she said. He nodded and went back the way he came. She pushed through the door. The building interior was climate-controlled and quiet in the specific way that administrative spaces are quiet, not peaceful, but managed. The sounds of the base muffled to something distant and organized. She passed 2 junior officers in the hallway, who both glanced at her and then looked away with the practiced neutrality of people trying not to be noticed, noticing something. At the end of the corridor, the door to the Admiral's conference room was open. She stepped in. Admiral Kincaid was already there. He was a compact man, silver-haired, with a kind of face that had been weathered into something permanent by decades of decisions that couldn't be undone. He was standing at the far end of the table, not sitting, which meant he wasn't treating this as a routine briefing. Across from him stood a man Mara had never seen before. Older than Kincaid, maybe mid-60s. He was wearing civilian clothes, clean. Plain, nothing that identified anything, but the way he stood said everything his clothes didn't. He stood like someone who had once been required to be dangerous and had never fully stopped. Still economical, completely at ease in a way that took tremendous discipline to maintain. There were no medals on his chest, no insignia, no rank, nothing. Just presence. "Sergeant Voss," Kincaid said. "Thank you for coming early." "Sir." "Sit down, both of you." They sat. The older man moved to the chair across from Mara without introducing himself. He set his hands flat on the table and looked at her with eyes that were doing something specific, not assessing her the way Harlan had assessed her, measuring her against his own standard, but reading her the way you read a landscape before you move through it, looking for what was actually there. "This is Chief Caleb Rourke," Kincaid said. The name didn't land softly. It didn't land the way famous names sometimes land, with a flash of recognition and excitement. It landed like weight, like the name of something that has existed for a long time and carries history in it that doesn't always get told in full. Chief Caleb Rourke, retired Navy SEAL, 26 years of operational service portions of which remained classified at levels most people in the room would never be cleared to access. The architect of 3 training programs that had reshaped how the military thought about pressure performance. A man who had, according to the stories that circulated in quiet corners of the community, declined every medal offered to him after his 3rd tour, on the grounds that the men who hadn't come home deserved them more. He had been out of service for 4 years. Nobody was entirely sure what he had been doing in those 4 years. Nobody asked. Mara looked at him. He looked at her. "I heard about this morning," he said. His voice was low, unhurried, with a texture that suggested it had been through things. Not rough exactly, just used. "Word travels fast," she said. "This base is small." A pause. "The second shot, at 800. Unfamiliar rifle, no zero data. How did you make that adjustment so quickly?" "Observation on the first shot, felt the trigger break, made internal corrections." "In how long?" "Between the first and second shot, at about 4 seconds. Rourke looked at Kincaid briefly, then back at her. "That's not standard." "No, sir, it isn't." "Where did you learn to do it that way?" She paused, because the honest answer was Arden Ridge. But saying Ardent Ridge in this room in front of this man who clearly already knew what had happened at Ardent Ridge was a different thing than saying it on the range in front of Harlan. There it had been a defense. Here it would be something else. Here it would be an acknowledgement of something that had fundamentally changed how she processed everything. "I learned it because I had to," she said finally. Rourke nodded, slowly, like that answer confirmed something he had already suspected. "Let me tell you why you're here," Kincaid said, leaning forward slightly. "Not the official reason, the real one." Mara waited. "We've been watching the performance data from the last 3 advanced marksmanship cohorts. The technical scores are high. The standard evaluations look good on paper. But the field outcomes are not matching the training outcomes. Soldiers who score in the top percentile here are making critical errors under real pressure in the field, not skill errors, decision errors, judgment errors. The kind that happen when the variables stop being controlled and the weight of the situation exceeds what the training prepared them for." He paused. "Let that settle. Chief Rourke has been consulting on a solution, and the solution requires someone with a very specific profile." Mara looked at Rourke. "Someone," Rourke said, "who has been in the situation where the training runs out, where the variables are no longer controlled, where one decision made alone under complete uncertainty is the only thing standing between outcome A and outcome B." The room was very quiet. "And lived to understand what that felt like from the inside," he continued, "not from observation, not from study, from experience." Mara felt something tighten in her chest. Not fear, something more specific. The feeling of a door being opened that you have kept carefully closed for a long time. "You want me to teach it," she said. "We want you to build it," Kincaid said. "A program, real pressure training, not simulated stress, real cognitive and psychological load. The kind of training that prepares a soldier not just for the physical execution of a skill, but for the moment when everything they know isn't enough, and they have to reach for something deeper." "How long have you been planning this?" "The concept, about 18 months. The specific personnel." Kincaid glanced at Rourke. "That took longer." Mara was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "And Harlan, does he know what this meeting is about?" "He knows an admiral asked to meet with you," Kincaid said carefully. "He doesn't know the full scope yet. He's going to resist it." "He's going to try out," Rourke said. And something in the way he said it, flat factual, without drama, suggested he had seen that particular pattern before and was not especially concerned by it. "I have a question," Mara said. Both men waited. "The soldiers from this morning's range session, the ones who were there, what about them?" "I want them in the first cohort." A pause. Kincaid raised an eyebrow. Not surprised exactly. More like he was recalibrating his read on her. "They mocked you," he said. "I know. That's not a standard basis for cohort selection." "No, sir, but it's an honest one." She looked at Rourke. "They reacted the way they reacted because nobody has ever taught them differently. That's not their failure. That's a gap in the system. And if this program is about filling real gaps, then that seems like the place to start." Rourke looked at her for a long moment, Then he reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and placed something on the table between them. A single bullet. Brass casing, full metal jacket, set upright on the polished wood surface like a statement. Mara looked at it. Before anything else, Rourke said quietly, I need to know something. She looked up. What you did at Arden Ridge, he said. The shot. Can you do it again? The question sat between them like the bullet itself. Solid, unavoidable. And in the silence that followed, the whole story of what was coming, the range, the watching soldiers, the wind, the disc, the one perfect moment was already beginning to take shape, though none of them could see it yet in full. Mara looked at the bullet. She didn't touch it. Not yet. Ask me again, she said quietly, when there's something worth shooting at. Rourke picked up the bullet. He didn't put it away. He just held it between two fingers, looking at it the way a man looks at something that means more than its physical weight suggests. Then he set it back down, this time closer to Mara's side of the table, and he leaned back in his chair and said nothing for a full 10 seconds. Kincaid let the silence stand. That told Mara something. Men like Kincaid didn't surrender control of a room easily. The fact that he was letting Rourke drive this conversation meant Rourke's read on her mattered more than the Admiral's own. That told her something else too. This wasn't a job offer wrapped in protocol. This was an audition, and the audience had been watching since before she walked through the door. Ask me again, she had said, when there's something worth shooting at. Rourke had heard that. He was still hearing it. She could see him turning it over. Tell me about the moment, he said finally. Not the shot, the moment before it. Mara looked at him steadily. That's classified, Chief. I have the clearance. Then you've already read the report. Reports tell me what happened. I'm asking what it felt like. She was quiet for a moment. Outside, somewhere on the base, a vehicle engine turned over and then went silent. The building's ventilation system hummed at a frequency just below conscious awareness. It felt like time stopped being linear, she said. Rourke didn't react. He just waited for more. Not slow motion. That's not what I mean. It's more like everything that was going to happen and everything that had already happened collapsed into the same moment. And I was just sitting in the middle of it, completely still, completely clear. Were you afraid? Yes. And I made the shot anyway. That's the whole story. Rourke looked at Kincaid. Something passed between them. Not words, just the specific kind of eye contact between two people who have been in enough rooms together to communicate in shorthand. Kincaid nodded once. Rourke turned back to Mara. There's something you need to see before you decide anything. He stood. Kincaid stood. And Mara understood that the meeting had just changed shape. What had started as a conversation, it was now moving somewhere physical. She stood and followed them out of the conference room, down the corridor, and through a side door that opened onto a narrow covered walkway connecting Building C to the secondary operations structure on the eastern side of the base. Nobody spoke on the walk over. She noticed Rourke's gait, left foot landing slightly heavier than the right. Old injury well compensated. He'd learned to move around it so completely that most people would never notice. She noticed it because she had done the same thing with her right shoulder for 2 years after Arden Ridge until the physical therapy finally closed the gap. The secondary operations building had a briefing room in the back that Mara had never been inside. The door required a key card that Kincaid produced without comment. Inside, the lights were already on, which meant someone had been here recently. A screen on the far wall showed a still image, a pause frame from what looked like a training evaluation video. On-screen a range, different from Fort Drayton's, bigger, more open, and in the foreground visible from behind a soldier in a prone position behind a precision rifle. This was taken 8 months ago, Kincaid said. Advanced marksmanship final evaluation. Highest scoring cohort we've had in 6 years. He pressed a button. The video ran. The soldier on screen executed a flawless sequence. Clean position, smooth trigger, control. Consistent breathing, tight groups at distance. Technically, it was exceptional. By every measurable standard, this was exactly the kind of performance the program was designed to produce. Perfect score, Kincaid said. The evaluators called it one of the best performances they'd seen. He let the video run for another 20 seconds. Then he stopped it and switched to a different file. This was the same soldier. 4 months later, Helmand Province. The footage was from a body camera. Shakier. Real. The audio was distorted, but present wind ambient noise, the sound of someone breathing hard. The shot when it came was wrong, not by much, not in a way that would look catastrophic on paper, but in the specific context shown in the footage wrong was enough. And the consequences of that wrongness played out in the 30 seconds after the shot in a way that made the room feel smaller. Kincaid stopped the footage. Nobody said anything. Mara understood now why they were standing in this room. She understood what the gap was, not a gap in skill, but a gap between what skill looks like when everything is controlled and what it looks like when nothing is. The two videos weren't showing two different soldiers. They were showing the same soldier in two different conditions. And the training had only prepared him for one of them. "He's okay," Kincaid said quietly, as if reading the question she hadn't asked. "Physically, but he left the service 6 weeks after that deployment." The room held that information for a moment. "How many?" Mara asked. "How many what?" "How many soldiers from the last 3 cohorts have comparable outcomes?" A pause. 11 confirmed cases with documented decision failure under pressure. Suspected more. 11 out of a program that graduated 30 soldiers per cohort, over 3 cohorts. That was not a statistical anomaly. That was a pattern. That was a structural failure dressed up in high evaluation scores. "When do you want to start?" she said. Rourke almost smiled. It wasn't a full smile, more a slight shift in the set of his mouth that suggested something close to satisfaction. The kind a man allows himself when a long-held read on a person turns out to be accurate. "There's still the matter of the demonstration," he said. She looked at him. "The bullet. The bullet. You're not taking my word for it." "I don't take anyone's word for anything that matters," he said. "And this matters." Kincaid cleared his throat. "Tomorrow morning, 0700, main range full configuration. I'll have the course set up." "What course?" "Rourke designed it." She looked at Rourke again. He reached into his jacket, and this time he set 3 items on the briefing room table. The single bullet from before. A small brass disc no larger than a quarter with a thin wire mount attached to its base. And a photograph printed not digital of a range configuration she had never seen before. Distance markers, wind gauges, a mechanical track system running perpendicular to the firing line. She looked at the photograph for a long time. The disc would be moving, at distance, variable speed dependent on the track system, in desert wind conditions that changed by the minute, with 1 round, no second shot, no adjustment sequence. "This isn't a qualification drill," she said. "No," Rourke said. "It's not. This is the ardent ridge condition, controlled enough to be observable, impossible enough to be real." "Yes." She looked at the disc again. Small, precise, the kind of target that removed every variable except the one that couldn't be trained for in a classroom. The one that lived in the space between knowing what to do and being able to do it when everything was pressing down on you at once. "Who else will be there?" she asked. "The full-range group from this morning," Kincaid said. "Harlan will be present." Something moved across her face, not surprise. Something more like the recognition that the full shape of this situation was now visible. It hadn't been visible from the range this morning or even from the conference room conversation. But standing here looking at a brass disc on a table and a photograph of an impossible course, she could see it all the way to the edges. This wasn't just an audition for a training program. This was a reckoning. For the base. For Harlan. For every soldier who had laughed that morning and every soldier who had stayed quiet when they shouldn't have. For the 11 men in those reports who had been graduated with perfect scores and sent into conditions their training had never touched. Tomorrow morning would decide something that went much further than whether Sergeant Maravos could make a difficult shot. She picked up the bullet, held it, set it back down. 0700, as she said, "I'll be there." She was back in her quarters by 15:30. She didn't eat, didn't sleep. She sat on the edge of the bed and she let the full weight of the day move through her without trying to manage it, which is the only way to actually process it, not pushing it away, not analyzing it to death, but letting it sit until it finds its own level. Harlan's voice replaying. She got her whole team killed, the rifle hitting the floor. The third shot at 800 meters, Rourke's eyes reading her like a landscape. The 11 soldiers in the report, the disc. She thought about Marcus. She thought about Chen. She thought about Diaz and Holloway. She thought about the 4 names that weren't in any public record connected to Arden Ridge, because the records that mentioned them had been classified, which meant they had been erased in the specific bureaucratic sense that feels like a second loss after the first one. She hadn't cried for them in a long time, not because the feeling wasn't there, but because she had learned that the feeling wanted action, not tears. It wanted to be made into something, put into motion, given purpose. Tomorrow was that purpose. At 1700, someone knocked on her door. She opened it. Corporal Davis stood in the corridor, out of uniform, off-duty in civvies, which made him look younger and more uncertain. He was holding something that took her a moment to identify as a printed copy of a regulation document. "Can I help you, Corporal?" He stopped, started again. "I looked up the regulation on range weapons substitution. During a standard evaluation. The one Commander Harlan when he switched the rifle on you this morning." She waited. "It requires written authorization from base command. Signed before the substitution happens. Not after. Before." He held out the printed page. "He didn't have that. I checked the log. There's no authorization on file." She looked at the page, then at him. "Why are you bringing this to me?" He shifted his weight. "Because what he did was wrong. You knew that this morning." "Yeah." He looked at the floor briefly, then back up. "Yeah, I did. And you laughed anyway." A long pause. "Yes, ma'am." She looked at him for a moment. In his face, she could see the specific discomfort of someone who has done a small wrong thing and is trying to figure out how to sit with it. It wasn't a dramatic guilt. It was the quiet, nagging kind that doesn't shout but doesn't go quiet either. The kind that makes you look up regulations at 1700 on a day off. "Keep the document," she said. "Don't you want it?" "I know what the regulation says. What matters is that you know it now." She paused. "Is that the only reason you came?" He hesitated, just long enough. "I heard there's something happening tomorrow morning," he said. "On the main range, people are talking." "People here always talk." "Is it true about a shot, about Chief Rourke being involved?" She studied him. He was scared. Not of her, or not only of her. Scared of what tomorrow might be. Scared in the way young soldiers get scared when they sense that the ground under a situation is shifting and they don't know yet which way to stand. "Get some sleep, Corporal," she said. "Yes, ma'am." He turned to go, then stopped. "For what it's worth, the third shot this morning. At 800. I was watching the monitor. I've never seen anyone do that on an unfamiliar weapon." She held his eyes. "Well, go to sleep," she said, not unkindly. He went. She closed the door and stood in the middle of the room for a moment. Davis was the first crack. Not in her and them, in the wall that Harlan had built with his certainty and his rank and his public performance of doubt. One soldier off duty looking up regulations and showing up at a door he didn't have to knock on. That was a crack. Small, but real. At 2000 hours, her phone buzzed. A message from an unsaved number that she recognized immediately as Rourke's format, stripped down, no greeting, no sign-off. Just information. Wind forecast for 0700, 12 to 18 knots, variable direction. Disk speed randomized, range 4 to 9 meters per second. Distance 940 meters. She read it twice. 940 meters. Not 800. 940. In variable wind, with a disk moving between 4 and 9 meters per second on a randomized track. With one round, she put the phone face down on the bed. 940 meters was not a standard sniper engagement distance. It was not even a standard competition distance. At that range with a moving target, the margin for a clean hit without a zeroed rifle and without wind data measured in real time at the target location was something that most precision shooters would look at and quietly, privately consider impossible. And Rourke had designed it that way. Not to humiliate her. She understood that now. He had designed it that way because he needed to know. Not believe, not hope, but know whether what she had done at Arden Ridge was a one-time convergence of circumstances or whether it was something that lived in her. Something reliable, something that could be taught, because you cannot teach what you cannot demonstrate. And if she was going to stand in front of soldiers and tell them that real pressure performance is a learnable skill and not just the territory of people who got lucky under extreme conditions, she had to prove it first. Not for them. Not for Harlan, not even for Kincaid, for Rourke, who was the only person in this building who fully understood what he was asking. She lay back on the bed, stared at the ceiling, let her breathing slow. Let her mind go to Arden Ridge, not to relive it, but to revisit the specific quality of the stillness she had found there. The thing she had discovered in herself in that moment was real. She had touched it once under the most extreme conditions possible. The question Rourke was asking in the most direct way available to him was whether she could find it again. Deliberately, under controlled chaos rather than real chaos. In some ways that was harder. Real chaos has a clarity to it. When everything is actually falling apart, the mind strips itself down to what it needs. The noise falls away because the stakes are absolute, and the body knows it. Controlled chaos, a range and audience, a designed impossible problem requires you to generate that stripping down yourself. Without the help of actual mortal stakes, without the adrenaline of genuine survival, you have to do it from the inside, from choice, from discipline that goes deeper than training. She knew one more thing lying there in the dark. Tomorrow morning when she walked onto that range, Harlan would be there. And he would look at her with the full weight of everything he had put into doubting her, and the soldiers who had laughed would be there, and Davis would be there with his printed regulation in his quiet corner of beginning to understand. And Rourke would be standing somewhere off to the side, holding nothing, watching. And at some point he would reach into his jacket and he would place that bullet in her hand. And everything the morning's humiliation, the report with 11 names, the disc at 940 meters, the memory of Ardent Ridge and Marcus and Chen and Diaz and Holloway, all of it would compress into a single moment. One round, one shot, one chance to make something true that words alone could never make true. She closed her eyes. The wind from the forecast moved through her mind, 12 to 18 knots. Variable. She started reading it from the inside the way she always had. The way that wasn't technique exactly, it was something underneath technique. The place where knowing what to do and being who you are become the same thing. By 2200, she was asleep. Outside across the base in his own quarters, Corporal Davis was still awake. He had the printed regulation on his desk, and he was staring at it without reading it anymore. Thinking about tomorrow. Thinking about the way she had looked at him in the doorway, not angry, not forgiving, just direct, just honest in a way that left no room for comfortable distortions. You laughed because you were afraid. He turned the light off. In the main officer's wing, Harlan sat at his desk with the range evaluation logs open on his screen. He was looking at the shot placement data from that morning. The third shot at 800 meters. He had called it a lucky adjustment to her face. He had said it with the confidence of a man who needed it to be true. But he had been looking at the data for 2 hours. And the thing that was sitting in his chest that wound with pressure applied had not gone away. It had gotten quieter in a way that was more unsettling than noise. The quiet of something shifting underground. Slow. Structural. He closed the screen. He did not sleep easily. And on the far end of the base in the secondary operations building, Rourke sat alone in the briefing room in the dark, the single bullet standing upright on the table in front of him, and he sat with the particular patience of a man who has spent his life waiting for moments that matter. He was not nervous. He was certain. And certainty in a man like Rourke was never careless. It was earned, carefully, over a very long time. Tomorrow would either confirm what he believed, or it would ask him to start over. He did not believe it would ask him to start over. The alarm didn't wake her. She was already awake at 5:40, sitting on the edge of the bed and the dark hands loose in her lap, breathing the kind of slow and deliberate breath that isn't relaxation, it's preparation. There's a difference. Relaxation is letting go. Preparation is gathering everything in and making it still so it doesn't scatter when you need it most. She had slept 4 hours. That was enough. She had operated on less. At 6:10, she was dressed and moving. The base was already alive. It always was before the sun fully cleared the horizon, that particular quality of early military morning where the day hasn't declared itself yet, but the machinery is already turning. She passed 3 soldiers on the path toward the main range building. All 3 looked at her. None of them spoke, but the looks told her the word had spread further overnight than she had expected. They knew something was happening this morning. They just didn't know exactly what. At 6:28, she reached the main range and stopped. The configuration was different from anything she had seen here before. The standard target boards had been cleared from the downrange positions. In their place at a distance that she calculated immediately and confirmed with the range markers 940 meters out, a thin mechanical track had been installed, running perpendicular to the firing line. The brass disc, the one from Rourke's photograph, was mounted on a small wheeled carriage on the track currently stationary. A control box on a tripod stood to the right of the firing line, attended by a technician she didn't recognize. To the left of the firing line, a row of chairs had been set up, folding chairs, the kind used for briefings. Most of them were already occupied. She counted 31 soldiers, the full range group from yesterday plus a few she didn't recognize, all of them watching her walk in. The murmur that passed through them when she appeared was low, but she caught fragments of it. Her name, Rourke's name. The word impossible used twice in different tones, once skeptical, once almost reverent. Harlan was there. He was standing, not sitting at the far left of the line. Arms crossed, face doing the specific thing it did when he was managing his expression, controlled, professional. And underneath that control, something that had not fully settled since yesterday's third shot at 800 meters. He looked at her when she walked in and didn't look away, which meant he had decided that looking away would be a concession he wasn't willing to make. She noted him, filed it, moved on. Rourke was standing near the control technician. Civilian clothes again. He had a paper cup of coffee that he wasn't drinking, just holding the way people hold objects when they need something to do with their hands that isn't visibly nervous. He looked up when she approached. "Sleep," he asked. "Enough. Wind's already at 14, variable as forecast. I felt it on the walk over." He nodded, set the coffee down on a nearby surface, reached into his jacket pocket and held out his closed fist. She extended her hand, palm up. He placed the bullet in it without ceremony. One round, brass casing, cold from the morning air. She closed her fingers around it. "The rifle's on the bench," he said. "Same platform from yesterday's brief. You have 10 minutes to handle it before we begin." "Have you zeroed it?" "No." She looked at him. "Yesterday you made a significant adjustment on an unzeroed rifle in 4 seconds," he said. "I want to see if the process is replicable or situational." She understood. He wasn't handicapping her arbitrarily. He was removing the variable of preparation to isolate the variable that actually mattered, the internal process. The thing that couldn't be faked and couldn't be borrowed and couldn't be installed through a training manual. She walked to the firing bench. The rifle was a bolt-action precision platform, heavy and long, with a scope already mounted. She picked it up and went through her handling check, action barrel bolt trigger, methodically and without performance. Around her, she was aware of the watching soldiers, but she let their presence sit at the edge of her awareness rather than the center of it. This is a learnable skill, though most people never practice it deliberately. The ability to acknowledge a stimulus without feeding it your full attention. She found the balance point of the weapon, noted the trigger weight in her fingers, heavier than she preferred, maybe 2 pounds over her usual setup. She adjusted her mental model, filed it, 8 minutes. She set the rifle down and turned to face the group. Harlan spoke before she could. "Chief Rourke," his voice carried across the range with the practiced projection of someone who had given thousands of range commands. "With respect, can you explain the purpose of this exercise for the assembled personnel? Because what I'm looking at doesn't match any evaluation protocol I've been given documentation for." A few heads turned toward Rourke. The question was reasonable on its surface. Underneath it was something less reasonable, a man trying to reassert the authority that the previous day had started to erode. If Harlan could reframe this morning as an irregular exercise he hadn't been properly briefed on, he could position himself as the reasonable institutional voice against whatever was about to happen. Rourke turned and looked at him. Just looked. The way a very old tree looks at weather. "It's a demonstration, Commander," he said. "Sergeant Voss will attempt to hit a moving target at 940 meters with 1 round using an unzeroed rifle in current wind conditions." Silence. Then a voice from the chairs, Private Kellerman, 23 years old, who had laughed the loudest yesterday morning. "That's not possible." He said it reflexively before he'd thought about whether saying it out loud was a good idea. Then he looked around and seemed to realize he'd said it out loud. "That's a fair assessment," Rourke said without looking at Kellerman. "Most things that matter looked impossible before someone did them." Kellerman pressed his lips together and said nothing else. Harlan hadn't finished. "Chief, I have to be direct. I think this exercise creates an expectation that is not grounded in documented performance data. Sergeant Voss's qualification scores are solid, but there is nothing in her file that—" "Commander," Kincaid's voice. Everyone turned. Kincaid had entered from the side access without anyone noticing, or perhaps they had noticed and simply hadn't registered it because the focus of the room had been elsewhere. He was in full uniform. That detail alone shifted the weight of the morning. An admiral in full uniform at a range evaluation at 0700 was not standard. It was a statement. "I've been briefed on the exercise," Kincaid said, walking to stand beside Rourke. "It has my authorization. Please continue." Harlan's jaw moved. He uncrossed his arms, crossed them again. His posture stayed correct. Years of training made sure of it, but the small physical adjustments said what his face was working hard not to. He sat down. Mara watched him sit, and in that moment she felt something she hadn't expected to feel. Not satisfaction, something quieter, almost sad. Because Harlan was not a stupid man, and he was not a cruel man at his core, and what she was watching was a proud person in the process of being made small by circumstances that had moved faster than his ability to adapt. That's a painful thing to watch, even when the person brought it on themselves. She turned back to the rifle. 2 minutes, Rourke said. She got into position, prone elbows down. Weight balanced across the body in the geometry that makes the platform stable for extended holds. She settled the rifle butt into her shoulder pocket and found the scope picture. Downrange 940 meters, the brass disc caught the early morning light and threw a small, sharp flash. Then the technician activated the track. The disc began to move. She heard the crowd react, a collective sound that was part breath and part something harder to name. Because watching the disc move at actual speed across that distance did something to a person's understanding of the problem. It wasn't abstract anymore. It was real. The disc was small. The distance was enormous. The wind was doing what variable wind does, changing direction in increments that were not predictable and not regular. And there was one bullet. One. Corporal Davis was in the third chair from the left. He had arrived earlier than most, which meant he had made a decision overnight about what kind of person he was going to be this morning. He was watching Mara's back, watching the slight adjustments in her position as she tracked the disc, and something was happening in his face that he wasn't fully aware of. The skepticism from yesterday was gone. In its place was something that hadn't found its name yet. Harlan was watching too. He had uncrossed his arms again. His hands were on his knees. He was leaning forward, slightly, also something he probably wasn't fully aware of. 30 seconds. Mara tracked the disc with the scope but did not follow it mechanically. She was doing something different. She was reading the pattern, speed variation, direction changes, the rhythm of the track system underneath the randomization. Nothing is truly random. Every mechanical system has tendencies. The randomization algorithm on the track carriage would have a range, a variance, a statistical center of gravity. She couldn't calculate it consciously in 30 seconds. But she didn't need to calculate it consciously. She needed to feel it, to let the pattern register in the part of her brain that processes rhythm and movement below the level of deliberate thought. She had learned this at Ardent Ridge, not from training, from necessity. 45 seconds. The wind shifted. She felt it on the left side of her face. A degree change, maybe 2. She recalibrated without moving, just updated the internal model. The model that held distance, wind rifle behavior, disc speed, everything not as a set of calculations, but as a felt landscape. A terrain she was moving through in her mind while her body stayed completely still. 60 seconds. Someone in the chairs whispered something. She didn't hear the words. She heard the shape of it. Nervous hush, the specific quality of people watching something that has exceeded their ability to predict the outcome. Rourke was watching her, not the disc. He had been watching her, not the disc, since she got into position. Because the disc was not what he was evaluating. He already knew the disc's parameters. He had designed them. What he was evaluating was what was happening inside her. Whether the stillness he had seen in her answers yesterday and in her file before yesterday was structural, built into who she was, or whether it was performance. Learned behavior she could maintain in a conversation, but that would fracture under actual load. He was watching for fracture. He did not see it. 90 seconds. The disc reached one end of the track, paused a half second, reversed. Mara's breathing was audible to herself and to no one else. 4 counts in, 4 counts out. Slower than normal resting breath, which sounds counterintuitive under pressure. Most people breathe faster. Slowing it down is the trained response, and it only works if the training has gone deep enough to override the body's default panic protocol. Hers had gone deep enough. 2 minutes. Davis realized his hands were gripping the edge of his chair. He consciously released them, looked down at the marks his fingers had left, looked back up. Harlan had stopped leaning forward. He had gone very still himself. Not in the way Mara was still, not deliberately, not as a skill, but in the involuntary stillness of a man who has stopped managing his reaction because the reaction has gotten bigger than the management. He was watching her, and he was thinking about the third shot yesterday, and he was thinking about the regulation Davis had looked up and hadn't brought to him directly, and he was thinking about the 11 soldiers in whatever report Kincaid had on file that he hadn't been shown, and he was thinking for the first time with something approaching honesty about what he had done yesterday morning when he knocked that rifle off the rack. He hadn't thought of it as violence when he did it. He was thinking of it as violence now. 2 minutes, 40 seconds. The disc flashed in a shift of the light. Mara stopped tracking it. She became absolutely, completely still. The stillness that has a sound to it. The silence inside the silence. The crowd felt it. They didn't know what they were feeling, but they felt it, the specific quality of a moment that is about to become irreversible. The held breath of 31 people who had come here this morning with different agendas and were now every single one of them doing the same thing. Waiting. 10 seconds passed. The disc moved. The wind shifted again, this time back, partial correction toward neutral. 15 seconds. 20. Kellerman, who had said it was impossible, had both hands pressed flat on his thighs. His mouth was slightly open. 25. She lost it, someone murmured, very quietly, almost to themselves. Rourke heard it. He said nothing. 30 seconds of stillness. And then Mara found it. Not the disc, not the wind calculation, not the trigger break point. She found the moment, the specific, unrepeatable, unscheduled convergence of all the variables into the single instant where everything aligned. Wind speed, distance, breath, heartbeat, the rifle's natural tendency corrected for the disc at the precise arc of its movement where the geometry worked. She didn't think it. She felt it. And she fired. The sound of the shot cracked across the range and rolled out into the desert and kept going the way sound does when there's nothing to stop it, just open land and sky and distance. 940 meters away, the brass disc disappeared. Not fell, not spun, disappeared. Clean impact, full strike the disc, and its mount knocked completely off the track carriage and into the ground behind it. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. The technician looked at his monitor, looked up, looked back at the monitor. Clean hit, he said. His voice came out slightly higher than he intended. Full impact, center of disc. The silence that followed was the loudest silence Mara had ever stood inside. Not because of what she had done, because of what it meant. She got up from the prone position slowly, the way you move when the adrenaline is present, but you're not letting it run. She put the rifle back on the bench. She stood straight. She turned to face the group. 31 faces looking at her. Not cheering, not applauding, just looking with the specific expression of people whose understanding of something has just been fundamentally revised, and they haven't caught up to the revision yet. Harlan was on his feet. She hadn't seen him stand. He was just standing. His arms were at his sides. His face was doing something she had not seen it do in the 2 days since she'd arrived on this base. It was doing something unmanaged. That's not, he started, stopped. Mara looked at him directly, not with triumph, with something quieter and more serious. Commander, she said, her voice was even. It always was. You asked yesterday which I was, a survivor or a shooter. She paused. Those aren't two different things. They never were. Harlan opened his mouth. Nothing came out. And that specific moment of a man who has built his identity on certainty, finding himself without words, was the crack becoming something larger. Not a collapse, not a demolition. Just the sound of something load-bearing, shifting, making room for a different shape. Davis stood up from his chair. He didn't know he was going to until he was already doing it. He wasn't sure what standing meant in this context. It wasn't applause, wasn't a formal gesture, wasn't anything he could have named. It was just the physical expression of something that needed to be expressed. Kellerman looked at Davis standing, looked at the empty space above the disc track 940 meters away. Looked back at Davis. He stood up too. Rourke watched all of it from where he stood beside Kincaid. He watched Mara. He watched Harlan. He watched the soldiers standing up one by one in the way that things happen when one person does a thing and another person realizes they were waiting for permission. He watched the morning reordering itself around a fact that couldn't be argued with. Kincaid leaned slightly toward him, spoke quietly. Well, Rourke picked up the paper cup of coffee he had set down earlier. Finally took a drink of it. It was cold. She'll do, he said, which from Caleb Rourke was not an understatement. It was the highest thing he knew how to say. The soldiers were still standing when Kincaid stepped forward. Not all of them had stood. Maybe 20 of the 31. But 20 out of 31 on a military base without anyone giving an order, that was not a small thing. That was the room deciding something for itself. And rooms that decide things for themselves are harder to redirect than rooms that are simply following instruction. Harlan felt that. He was still on his feet, still looking at the space where the disc had been, and the feeling in his chest had moved past the uncomfortable stage into something raw, something that didn't have a clean military name. It was the feeling of a man who has been wrong in public and knows it and hasn't yet figured out what to do with that knowledge. Kincaid walked to the center of the firing line and turned to face the group. His voice carried without effort the voice of someone who had commanded large rooms for so long that projection was simply how he spoke. What you just witnessed, he said, is not a trick. It's not a performance. It's not the product of unusual luck or a favorable morning. He paused. Let the range and the distance speak for a moment. It is the product of a specific kind of training that most of you have never received. And that gap between what the best technical training produces and what real pressure demands is exactly what we are here to close. Nobody moved. Sergeant Voss has been asked to lead a new program. It begins in 3 weeks. The first cohort will be selected from this base. Another pause. Deliberate. Participation is voluntary, but I want to be direct with you. The soldiers from the last 3 graduating cohorts of our advanced program are underperforming in the field in ways that our evaluation scores did not predict. That is a failure of the system, not of those soldiers, and it will not continue. Kellerman, still standing, raised his hand. The gesture was so instinctive, so school classroom, that the soldier next to him almost smiled. Almost. Sir, what kind of training? Kincaid looked at Mara. She stepped forward. This was the first time she had addressed the full group directly without the adversarial framing that Harlan had constructed around every previous exchange. She looked at Kellerman first because he had asked and because he was the one who had laughed loudest yesterday, and starting there was the honest choice. Pressure training, she said. Not simulated stress, actual cognitive and psychological load. The kind that makes you understand the difference between knowing how to do something and being able to do it when everything real is happening at once. She let that sit for a second. You all scored well on your qualifications. You know your weapons. You know your protocols. What you haven't been tested on is what happens inside you when the protocols run out. Silence. That's not a criticism, she continued. That's the gap, and gaps can be closed, but only if you're willing to work in territory that's uncomfortable. Not physically uncomfortable. Most of you can handle physical discomfort fine. Psychologically uncomfortable. The kind where you have to look at how you think under pressure and be honest about what you find. Davis was watching her with an expression she recognized. The expression of someone hearing a thing they have been circling around for a long time without knowing how to say it. Then Harlan spoke. Sergeant Voss. The room shifted because his tone was different. Not the commanding projection from yesterday, not the performance of authority, something flatter, more personal. The voice of a man speaking from a place that has had some of its armor removed. Yes, sir. The rifle yesterday morning, when He stopped, started again. The substitution, without written authorization. He looked directly at her. That was wrong. The range went so quiet you could hear the wind moving across the sand at the base of the perimeter fence. Nobody had expected that. Not Davis, who had the regulation printout. Not Kincaid, who had known what Harlan had done and had chosen to address it through the architecture of this morning, rather than through a formal reprimand. Not Rourke, who had seen 1,000 versions of the moment when a proud person chooses accountability over self-protection and who recognized it immediately for what it was. Not Mara. She looked at Harlan for a long moment. I know, she said. I was trying to... He paused. Something moved across his face. I told myself I was testing you, evaluating whether the reputation matched the reality. Another pause. But that's not what I was doing. No, she said, it wasn't. What was I doing? She didn't answer immediately. She took the question seriously, not as a rhetorical device, but as a real question from a real person who genuinely wanted an honest answer. That's the only kind of question worth answering, honestly. You were afraid, she said, not of me specifically, of what it would mean if I was real. If the story was true. She held his eyes. Because if someone can do what the story says I did, if that's possible, then the standard you've built your program around has a ceiling you didn't know was there. And that's a hard thing to find out after 17 years. Harlan's jaw tightened, not in anger, in the specific way that faces tighten when a true thing lands. That's probably accurate, he said, quietly, for just her now, though everyone could still hear. It took courage to say what you just said in front of your soldiers, she said. More than most people would manage. He looked at her. Something in his expression was uncertain in a way she hadn't seen in him before. The uncertainty of someone standing on ground that has shifted and hasn't finished shifting. I'm not sure it was courage, he said. I'm not sure what it was. That's usually what courage feels like from the inside, she said. Rourke, standing 15 feet away, looked down at the ground and said nothing. But his expression had changed in a way that was very small and very significant. The specific shift of a man who has invested a long time in a belief and is watching the belief confirmed in real time. Kincaid cleared his throat. We'll move to the debrief room in Building C at 0830. Anyone with questions about the program, Sergeant Voss will take them there. He looked around the group. Dismissed for now. The group began to break up. The particular quality of the movement, slower than normal dismissal, people talking to each other in low tones, the constant glances back toward Mara, and towards the distance where the disc had been told the story of a group that had come in with one understanding of the morning and was leaving with a different one. Davis approached her before she had moved 2 steps. Sergeant Voss, she stopped. He was holding the regulation printout. He had brought it with him this morning, which she only now registered. He held it out to her. I don't need it anymore, she said. I know. He looked at it. I wanted you to know I brought it, that I wasn't just thinking about it. She looked at him carefully. This was a young man in the process of becoming something he wasn't yet, but was moving toward. You could see it in the specific effort of his posture, the way he was standing like someone who has decided to stand differently than he stood yesterday. Keep it, she said. Somewhere you'll see it. Why? Because it's the first time you stood up for something when it would have been easier not to. That's worth remembering. He folded it, put it in his breast pocket. Kellerman appeared at Davis's shoulder. He looked like a man who had rehearsed something and wasn't sure anymore if it was the right thing to say. Sergeant, he stopped. I said it was impossible. This morning. I heard you. I was wrong. Yes, she said, you were. He blinked. He had expected something softer, a reassurance, that's okay. She watched him recalibrate. You're not going to let me off easy, he said. More observation than accusation. No, she said, but I'm not going to hold it over you either. There's a difference between not letting you off easy and holding it over you. Kellerman thought about that for a second, then nodded slowly with the deliberateness of someone storing a thing they intend to use later. Will you actually take us, he asked, in the program, after yesterday? I already told the Admiral. The soldiers from yesterday's range session are the first cohort. Because we failed the test. There was no test yesterday, she said. Yesterday was just the morning. How you reacted told me where you are. That's useful information, not a verdict. He looked at her for a long moment. Then something in his face settled, the kind of settling that happens when a person stops performing their skepticism and lets themselves just be where they actually are. I'll sign up, he said. Good. At 8:20, she was walking toward Building C for the debrief when Rourke fell into step beside her. They walked without speaking for 30 seconds. This was not awkward. It was the specific comfort of 2 people who have established enough understanding that silence doesn't require filling. Harlan, he said finally, what about him? That was unexpected. It shouldn't have been, she said. He's a good soldier. He was in a bad position that he put himself in and couldn't see a way out of. When a person like that finds a door they can actually walk through, they usually walk through it. Most people don't. Most people aren't at Harlan. He's hard and he's proud, and he built everything on a standard he believed in. But underneath all of it, he's honest. You can work with honest. Rourke was quiet for a moment. You've been reading people since you got here. Haven't you? He made a sound that was almost a laugh. Not quite. Close enough. The program, he said. 3 weeks. You have full design authority. I'll consult, but I won't direct. This is yours. I know what I want to do with it. Tell me. She had been thinking about it since the night before, since she lay on the bed and let the morning settle and thought about the 11 soldiers in the report. She had been shaping it in the way that plans take shape when they come from somewhere real, not built top down from theory, but grown from the inside of actual experience. The first 2 weeks are not about shooting, she said. They're about failure, controlled failure, situations designed so they can't fully succeed. Because the soldiers coming into this program have been told their whole training lives that the goal is the perfect score. And perfect scores don't prepare you for the moment when there is no perfect score available, and you have to make the best decision you can with incomplete information and live with the outcome. Rourke nodded, walking, not looking at her, just nodding. Week 3 is integration, bringing the shooting back in after they've spent 2 weeks building a relationship with uncertainty. So the weapon becomes an extension of a more honest self-understanding instead of a performance of competence they're desperately trying to protect. And Harlan, she paused. What do you mean? He has 17 years of program experience, deeply embedded with this base. If his posture changes, and what I saw this morning suggests it might, he becomes an asset rather than an obstacle. She thought about that. You want me to involve him. I want you to decide whether to involve him. It's your program. She was quiet for a moment. In her comment, she was running the question the way she ran calculations, not forcing an answer, just making space for the honest one to surface. Not in the first cohort, she said finally. That would be too fast, and it would be too complicated for the soldiers who watched this morning. They need to see a clean line first. But after the first cohort graduates, she paused. Yeah, I think he could be part of it. He'll have to change. He already started, she said. They reached the door of Building C. Rourke stopped. One more thing, he said. She turned. He reached into his jacket, and for a moment she thought he was going to produce another bullet, another test, another threshold, another thing that needed proving. But what he took out was a photograph. He held it out to her. She took it. It was a group photo, military taken outdoors, the kind of photograph that gets taken at the end of something significant. She didn't recognize the location. She didn't recognize most of the faces. But in the back row on the far right, young, maybe 24 or 25, with the specific look of someone who hasn't yet been through the things that would later define them, she recognized one face. Her own. She stared at it. That's the cohort from Barstow, Rourke said. 12 years ago, basic precision course. She remembered Barstow, barely. She had been 24. It had been before Ardent Ridge, before everything that made her the person standing here now. You were there, she said. I ran that course, he said. You didn't know. I was evaluating candidates for a different program, one that never got fully funded. A pause. I marked your file then, 12 years ago. Specific notation potential for high-pressure performance that exceeds technical profile. She looked up from the photograph. You've been watching me for 12 years, she said. Watching is the wrong word. Tracking, keeping the file current, waiting for the right moment. And Ardent Ridge confirmed what I had written down 12 years ago. He looked at her steadily. I didn't choose you because of Ardent Ridge, Mara. I chose you because of who you were before it. Ardent Ridge just proved to everyone else what I already knew. The weight of that landed differently than anything else had landed that morning, because it meant the story was longer than she had understood it to be. It meant the moment that had defined her publicly, the shot, the survival, the classified file, was not the beginning of who she was. It was the confirmation of something that had already been real for a long time. She looked at the photograph for another moment. Then she handed it back to him. Keep it, he said. She held it. At 8:30, the debrief room in Building C held 27 soldiers, Admiral Kincaid, Rourke, and Mara. Harlan arrived 2 minutes late. He took a seat near the back, not the front where he would usually position himself, and he sat without comment. Nobody pointed it out, but everyone registered it. Mara stood at the front of the room. No podium, no slides, no notes. Just herself and the 30 seconds of quiet she gave the room before she started speaking, which is one of the things she had learned about rooms. They need a moment to settle before they're ready to receive something real. I want to start with something honest, she said. I almost didn't take this assignment. The room's attention sharpened, not because of the program, because of the part that requires standing in front of people and telling them that the way they've been trained has a gap. That's a hard conversation to start, because most of the people in a room like this have worked hard, have committed, have done everything they were told to do and done it well. She looked around, and it feels like an accusation when someone tells you it wasn't enough. A few slight movements in the chairs, people resettling, the physical language of something recognized. It's not an accusation, she said. It's an honest inventory. And honest inventories are the only ones worth taking. Davis had his hands on his knees. He was very still. Kellerman was leaning forward, elbows on thighs, the posture of someone who has stopped protecting themselves from an incoming idea and decided to let it in. The program we're building is not about making you better shooters, she continued. Your technical skills are solid. What we're building is the architecture underneath the skill, the thing that holds when the skill alone isn't enough. She paused, and it will never be enough on its own. Not when lives are actually on the line. Not when the variables are real and the consequences are permanent and the decision is yours to make alone in a moment nobody trained you for specifically. She let that breathe. I know what that moment feels like. I've been inside it. And the only thing I can tell you with certainty is this: it is survivable. Not just physically, mentally, morally. You can make the right call in the worst possible moment, and you can carry what comes after, and you can keep going. But you have to have built something inside yourself that is bigger than your technique, and bigger than your score, and bigger than what any evaluation says about you. The room was completely still. That's what we're going to build, she said, starting in 3 weeks. The people who sign up for this, I'm not going to tell you it will be comfortable. I'm not going to promise you a good score at the end. What I can promise you is that you will come out the other side understanding yourself under pressure in a way you don't right now. And that understanding is the difference between the performance you give on an evaluation and the decision you make when it actually matters. Harlan in the back row was looking at his hands. Then he looked up. I'll be in the first cohort, he said. The room turned, head swiveling. The specific communal movement of people who have just heard something they did not expect and need a second to process. Mara looked at him. He held her eyes. There was no performance in it, no strategy, just a man who had done some of the hardest thinking of his recent life between yesterday morning and this morning, and had come to a conclusion that required him to say something out loud in front of his soldiers, which was the only way to make it real. With your permission, he added, to her, not to Kincaid, to her. She held his eyes for a long moment. You'll work like everyone else, she said. No rank consideration inside the program. Understood. And when the first session breaks you down, because it will, you stay in the room. His jaw tightened. Understood. Then yes, she said, you're in. Something passed through the room at that. Not applause, this wasn't that kind of moment. More like the sound of 27 people exhaling at the same time without meaning to. The collective release of a tension that had been building since yesterday morning when a rifle hit the concrete floor, and everyone who saw it knew in some part of themselves that something had gone wrong, and they didn't know how to say so. Now it had been said. Now it had been answered. Kincaid stood at 1000 hours and said the formal things: program, timeline, administrative details, sign-up process, chain of command structure. The practical architecture of turning a morning's reckoning into an actual institutional change. Mara listened and noted the details and let herself feel, just briefly and privately, the particular exhaustion that comes not from physical effort, but from the sustained concentration of holding a room's worth of human complexity without dropping any of it. She thought about Marcus, about Chen, about Diaz and Holloway. She thought about the decision she had made in the dark at Ardent Ridge, with no one to confirm her, and no guarantee of the outcome. And everything depending on a moment of stillness she had found inside herself that she hadn't known was there until she needed it. She thought about the 11 soldiers in the report, the ones who had scored perfectly and then fractured when the real conditions arrived. She thought about what might have been different for them if someone had built the thing she was now being asked to build. If someone had understood before they graduated and shipped out that there is a gap between knowing and being, and that the gap can be closed but only if you know it exists. She thought about the 12-year-old notation in Rourke's file, the version of herself at 24 who didn't know yet what she was being prepared for. None of us know what we're being prepared for. We just keep building. At 11:15, after the debrief room had emptied and the administrative details had been handed to the appropriate people, and Kincaid had walked back to his office with the satisfied expression of a man watching a long-term investment, Mature Rourke found her standing outside on the walkway, alone, looking in the direction of the main range, even though the range itself wasn't visible from here. He stood beside her. She was holding the photograph from Barstow, looking at the young face in the back row. 12 years, she said. Yes. You could have told me earlier, when we met yesterday. No, he said simply. You needed to do this morning first. So did they. He nodded back toward the building. So did Harlan. She was quiet for a moment. The wind moved across them. 14 knots, still variable, the same wind that had been there at 940 meters when she fired. What happens now, she said. You build the program, he said. You run the first cohort. You make mistakes and correct them and make better mistakes the second time. You take what you know from the inside and you find the language to give it to other people. He paused. That's the hard part. You know that. I know. Harder than the shot. Much harder, she said. He nodded, started to turn, then stopped. Marcus, he said quietly. Chen, Diaz, Holloway. She turned to look at him. I know the names, he said. They're in the real file, not the public one. He held her eyes. They would have wanted this. She didn't answer, because there was no answer that was adequate to that. There was only the truth of it settling into her chest next to everything else she carried, taking its place in the permanent architecture of who she was. She looked back toward the range. She thought about the moment the disc disappeared, the absolute clarity of that instant, the convergence, the rightness of it. One round, one shot, one chance. And the thing she had proven not to Harlan, not to the base, not to Rourke or Kincaid or any of the soldiers who had stood up in their folding chairs, the thing she had proven was not that she could make an impossible shot. It was that impossible is a word people use when they haven't yet understood the full dimension of what is possible. She put the photograph in her breast pocket next to her heart, and she turned and walked back toward the building where 27 soldiers were beginning to sign their names to something that would change them. And through them, the soldiers who came after, and through those soldiers, every decision made in every impossible moment that was still waiting out there in the future, unnamed and unscheduled and inevitable. She walked back in, and the work began.